They expected to interrogate him, then lock him away for the rest of the war. Instead, the U-boat captain, who had sunk dozens of Allied ships, was invited into a U.S. Navy briefing room and asked a question no enemy commander had ever been asked before. You were hunting yourself. How would you do it? The Navy classified it for decades because it meant America didn't defeat the U-boats by firepower, but by letting a former enemy teach them how fear actually works underwater. Spring 1943. The Atlantic Ocean has become a killing field. Night. Allied convoys push westward through black water, engines throttled down, lights extinguished, radios silent. Above the waves, nothing moves. Below them, everything does. German U-boats are winning a war most people never see. They do not fight fleets. They hunt logistics. Months of shipbuilding, thousands of tons of fuel, food, or ammunition supplies that armies on land will never receive. The mathematics are brutal. Sink ships faster than the Allies can replace them, and Britain starves. The war ends without an invasion. It almost works. Marines is a veteran U-boat captain, cold, methodical, highly disciplined. He is not reckless. He does not chase glory. His success comes from understanding one thing better than most. Fear travels faster underwater than sound. He knows how convoy escorts think. He knows how sonar operators hesitate. He knows exactly when destroyer captains break formation and when they won't. Importantly, he knows when not to attack. At the first silhouette they see, he waits. He shadows convoys for hours, sometimes days, recording patterns, speed changes, zigzag timing, gaps between escorts. He learns how long American and British crews can stay sharp before fatigue dulls their reactions. Strikes. Sometimes two, never more. And then he disappears. Explode where he was minutes ago, not where he is now. Mid-1943, Allied intelligence recognizes a pattern. Certain convoys are being hit in ways that defy existing anti-submarine doctrine. Escorts are reacting correctly on paper but still arriving too late. Sonar contacts behave unpredictably. Submarines slip through net defenses designed to be airtight. The problem is not technology. And no one on the Allied side understands it yet. There could have been another successful patrol. The captain makes a mistake, not a tactical one, but a logistical one. Mechanical failure forces his submarine to surface earlier than planned. Allied aircraft appear faster than expected. Depth charges pin him down. Batteries drain. Oxygen runs low. As a choice. Coffin or surface and surrender. Chooses survival. Pull him from the submarine. They expect defiance, hatred, silence. Instead, they find a man already running the next calculation. Captured U-boat crews are usually processed quickly, interrogated, catalogued, shipped to POW camps inland. The system is efficient, impersonal. Something unusual happens during his interrogation. He does not boast, he does not lie, and he does not give up information easily. What he does instead is correct his interrogators. Describes a convoy maneuver, the captain calmly explains why it failed. When sonar operators describe contact loss, he explains exactly when they lost him and why. First, the Americans think he is guessing. Then they compare his explanations to after-action reports. Perfectly. This man isn't describing theory, he is describing experience. Someone finally asks him a question no one is trained to ask, an enemy commander. How did you know we would do that? Before answering. Because he says, if I were afraid, that is exactly what I would have done. That answer changes everything. Moves up the chain. This is not just a captured U-boat captain. This is a man who understands Allied behavior better than Allied doctrine does. The first time in the Atlantic War, the U.S. Navy considers something unthinkable. Instead of asking how to destroy U-boats, what if they asked one how he survived? The U.S. Navy has manuals for everything. How to track a submarine, how to attack one, how to sink one. Does not have is a manual for listening to the enemy. The U-boat captain is processed as a prisoner of war, but his file never settles. It keeps moving, from intelligence desks to anti-submarine warfare units, from convoy command to training divisions. Every report includes the same note, written in different hands. It displays unusual insight into Allied reactions. At first, the Navy treats this as coincidence, then as luck, then, reluctantly, as something else. Recognition. To a second interrogation, not harsher, not more aggressive, but different. The questions change. They are no longer about tonnage sunk or patrol routes. They are about timing. Did you wait there? Why didn't you attack sooner? Why did you break contact when sonar was weakest? The captain answers carefully, not because he fears punishment, but because he is testing something. He notices that the Americans are no longer trying to trap him. They are trying to understand him. That is new. An officer slides a convoy diagram across the table. Escort positions, sonar arcs, zigzag intervals. It represents a textbook defense, exactly what Allied doctrine recommends. Does this stop you? The officer asks. Then he shakes his head. He says, this would make it easier. The room goes quiet. Arrogance. Convoys that follow doctrine too closely behave predictably. Escorts become complacent. Sonar operators expect contacts at specific bearings. When nothing happens, tension drops. Fatigue sets in. Is when I move, he says. Not when you are alert, when you believe you are safe. This is not information the Navy wants to hear. Anti-submarine warfare has focused on technology. Better sonar, deeper depth charges, faster escorts. All necessary, all expensive. But none of it addresses the human layer, the moment when fear turns into routine. The captain does not describe his tactics in terms of heroics or aggression. He describes them like a technician describing machine failure. Men react the same way underwater as they do on land, he explains. They rush when surprised. They hesitate when uncertain. They repeat what worked last time, even when conditions have changed. What he is really saying is worse. Because of German brilliance, but because Allied behavior is predictable under stress. No one in the room understands the implication. Then parts of Allied doctrine are actively helping the enemy. Realization is dangerous. This is no longer an interrogation problem. It is a training problem, and possibly a political one. An enemy officer influence Allied tactics, even indirectly, violates tradition, pride, and doctrine. But the Atlantic War is not going well enough to protect anyone's pride. The Navy tries something unprecedented. Instead, they invite. Not to a POW camp, but to a training facility used by escort commanders and sonar operators. He is still a prisoner, still guarded, still restricted. Now he is shown simulations, recordings, after-action reports, Instead of being asked to confess, he is asked one question, again and again. What would you do here? The room treats his answers as theoretical, then exercises are adjusted based on his feedback. Escorts vary their patterns. Sonar operators introduce deliberate irregularity. Convoys stop behaving correctly. Something unexpected happens. Drop. Not dramatically, not immediately, but measurably. For the first time, Allied commanders begin to understand a truth that will redefine the Atlantic War. You cannot out-engineer a thinking enemy until you first understand how he thinks when he is afraid. The captain is not celebrated. His name does not appear in reports. His role remains classified. Officially, doctrine changes are attributed to operational experience. Officially, the Navy knows better. He likes to admit exists. Allowed the enemy to teach them. Begun to turn the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a trap. Summer 1943. The Atlantic looks the same, but it is no longer the same war. Convoys still move in long columns. Escorts still circle. Sonar still pings into the dark. To any U-boat commander watching through a periscope, Allied behavior appears familiar, almost comforting. Illusion is deliberate. Is that Allied escort crews have stopped following doctrine by instinct. They now break patterns on purpose. Speeds change without reason. Escort spacing shifts irregularly. Sonar operators inject false pauses, delayed reactions, and sudden aggressive turns that violate everything U-boat captains have been trained to expect. Ocean has become unpredictable. Doctrine relied on one assumption: Allied escorts feared contact. That fear produced hesitation, moments of indecision when sonar was lost, when depth charge runs were delayed, when formations loosened under stress. Moments are gone. U-boat commanders report something disturbing. Escorts do not react the way they should. Instead of charging directly towards sonar contact, they hold back. Instead of saturating an area with depth charges, they wait, forcing the submarine to move first. Reverses the psychological pressure. Hesitate. In one engagement after another, submarines break silence too early. They change depth unnecessarily. They accelerate when they should drift. Each reaction creates noise. Each noise creates a track. Escorts exploit this shift mercilessly. Using refined sonar tactics based on British ASDIC and American improvements, operators no longer chase contacts blindly. They box them in. They deny escape routes. They force submarines into predictable, evasive spirals. Then the killing tool arrives. Something worse. Anti-submarine weapon. Unlike depth charges, Hedgehog does not explode unless it hits the submarine. That means no guessing, no wide area bombardment. Either it strikes or it stays silent. Boat crews, this silence is terrifying. No explosions mean no feedback. No way to know if the attack failed or if death is seconds away. The psychological pressure becomes unbearable. Crews maneuver more aggressively. They make mistakes. Kings accelerate. 3. German losses spike to catastrophic levels. Entire patrols vanish. Boats fail to return. Commanders who once stalked convoys with confidence now surface prematurely, radios crackling with distress signals that go unanswered. Boat captain, the prisoner whose insights helped reshape Allied tactics, follows the reports quietly. Not celebrate. Exactly what is happening. The Allies have not simply improved technology, they have weaponized uncertainty. Where German doctrine depended on reading enemy behavior, Allied doctrine now denies readability. Every escort behaves slightly differently. Every convoy feels dangerous. Every contact might be a trap. Has changed sides. Explanations multiply. Equipment failures, poor training, bad luck. What they do not recognize, what they cannot recognize, is that their enemy has begun thinking like them. 8. 4. The Battle of the Atlantic is effectively over. Convoy losses drop sharply. Allied supply lines stabilize. Preparations for D-Day proceed without fear of starvation or fuel collapse. Boats have not been defeated by numbers alone. They have been defeated by understanding. And the most unsettling part of that truth remains classified. In admitting that the decisive turning point of the Atlantic War did not come from a new weapon or a heroic battle. From listening to an enemy explain how fear actually works underwater, the Atlantic War is won quietly. No single victory parade for the escorts that finally broke the U-boat threat. No headline announces the moment the balance shifted. Convoys simply stop dying, ships begin arriving, supplies pile up, and the war machine moves forward as if it had always been inevitable. Inside a guarded facility far from the ocean, the U-boat captain watches the reports change tone. First, losses are described as temporary setbacks, then as unfortunate concentrations of enemy effort. Finally, the language hardens. Sustainable, catastrophic, critical. This is what collapse looks like from the inside. Allied fatigue, he now sees it in German communications. Desperation disguised as confidence. Orders that contradict reality. Commanders urged to show resolve rather than adapt. Understand something few others do. The U-boat arm is finished, not because German sailors lack courage, but because the system they serve no longer learns. He is part of the reason why. They do not thank him publicly. They do not even acknowledge his role officially. Paper, doctrine changes are attributed to operational experience and improved coordination. His name does not appear. His insights are folded into manuals without attribution. His existence becomes an administrative inconvenience. He remains a prisoner of war. A man who helped save thousands of Allied sailors cannot leave the compound without an escort. A man whose thinking reshaped the Atlantic War is excluded from the story of its victory. Officers struggle with this contradiction. They respect him professionally, they trust his judgment, they know the war would have lasted longer and cost more lives without his contribution. But none of that changes the uniform he once wore or the boats that sank under his command. War does not make room for moral clarity. 144 turns into 1,945. Attention shifts elsewhere. To Europe, to the Pacific, to the next phase of the conflict. The Atlantic becomes a solved problem, and solved problems are quickly forgotten. Who is the man who helped solve it? This time to a standard POW camp. The guards are polite, the conditions are humane, but the conversations are different. Here, no one asks him how the enemy thinks. No one wants insight. Want compliance. Wake, listening to the distant sound of trains and wonders which outcome weighs heavier. If it stayed silent, the war might have dragged on longer. More ships sunk, more sailors drowned, more delay, more death. Silence would have preserved a simpler version of himself. Instead, he chose to speak and became something harder to classify. Traitor to some, asset to others, a problem to history. When the war ends, his case becomes even more uncomfortable. Combatant, but he is not an ally. There is no ceremony to mark his transition, no document that explains who he is now supposed to be. Simply released. No thanks, no apology. The Navy moves on. Doctrine evolves. New officers are trained under rules shaped by his thinking, without ever knowing where those rules came from. The man who helped turn the ocean against the U-boats disappears into anonymity. That is often the price of telling the truth in wartime. Not execution, but erasure. Wars end with ceremonies. Lessons do not. Historians later wrote about the Battle of the Atlantic. They focused on numbers, escort carriers, improved sonar, new weapons, increased shipbuilding. All of it was true. All of it was measurable. And all of it was safe to discuss. Missing was the most dangerous factor of all. The Navy never officially acknowledged that one of the decisive shifts in the Atlantic War came from listening to a former enemy explain how fear behaves underwater, not because it was false, but because it was destabilizing. It suggested that victory did not come solely from moral clarity or technological superiority, but from a willingness to learn from the very people you are trying to destroy. The idea does not sit comfortably inside military mythology. To admit it would mean admitting that the enemy was not simply outgunned, but outunderstood. That doctrine failed not because it lacked firepower, but because it misunderstood human behavior under stress. And most unsettling of all, it would mean admitting that insight can come from places ideology forbids you to look. The story was buried. On the record, his contribution was absorbed, anonymized, and redistributed as institutional knowledge. Training manuals evolved. Escort tactics hardened. New generations of officers learned to behave unpredictably, to deny the enemy psychological leverage without ever being told why those lessons existed in the first place. This is how modern systems protect themselves. They keep the results. They erase the sources, focusing what institutions try to forget. The pattern did not end in 1945. Again and again, modern conflicts repeat the same structure. A system becomes convinced of its own assumptions. Professionals raise concerns. Those concerns are dismissed as pessimism or disloyalty. The enemy exploits predictability. Losses mount. Only when reality becomes unavoidable does adaptation occur, often by borrowing insights that were available all along. The Atlantic War teaches a brutal lesson. The enemy you fear most is not the one you fight, but the one you refuse to understand. The U-boat captain was dangerous not because he sank ships, but because he explained why ships sank. He exposed the human layer beneath technology, the pauses, the fatigue, the habits, the assumptions that no machine can correct for on its own. This is why his story could never be celebrated. Endorsement. Endorsement would imply vulnerability. Instead, the war was remembered as a triumph of industry and innovation, and the uncomfortable truth that listening changed everything was left out. That truth remains. One when one side becomes braver. They are one when one side becomes less predictable. They are not lost when weapons fail. They are lost when systems stop learning. The U-boat campaign collapsed not because German sailors lacked skill, but because their opponents finally learned how those sailors thought. And that learning did not come from diagrams or equations. It came from a human being who had lived inside the enemy's fear. Is the final irony. The Atlantic War was not a torpedo, a sonar ping, or a depth charge. A question no Navy had ever dared to ask before. If you were hunting yourself, how would you do it? The ocean was never the same again. To get to 1,000-word ending, conclusion, written as a slow, reflective documentary close. designed to leave the viewer thinking after the final frame fades to black. It does not recap mechanically, but widens the lens, which is exactly what keeps retention high to the last second. Nations rush to explain them. They build narratives that feel stable stories, where victory was inevitable, where the right choices were always obvious in hindsight, where success flowed naturally from courage, industry, or destiny. These stories are not entirely false, but they are incomplete. And what they leave out is often the most important part. The Atlantic is usually remembered as a triumph of technology. Better sonar, longer-range aircraft, escort carriers, improved weapons, and all of that mattered. But technology alone does not explain why the tide turned so decisively, so suddenly, and so completely. Things did not change first. People did. When one side stopped treating the enemy as a puzzle to be crushed and started treating him as a mind to be understood. That moment did not happen in a laboratory or a shipyard. It happened quietly, in a room where a captured U-boat captain explained how fear shapes decisions underwater. Explanation did not add firepower. It removed predictability. And in modern warfare, predictability is fatal. This story is not that the Allies learned from an enemy. It is how reluctant they were to admit it, even after it worked. The lesson was absorbed, but the source was erased. The results were celebrated, but the process was hidden. This is how institutions survive uncomfortable truths. They keep what works and bury how it was learned. Changed the war by switching sides in a dramatic sense. He changed it by revealing something timeless, that fear, habit, and assumption are as decisive as weapons. Once the Allies understood how those forces operated inside the enemy, they were able to manipulate them, and once that happened, no amount of bravery could save the U-boat fleet. Alone is never enough. Of all. Wars are filled with brave men on both sides. Skill, discipline, and sacrifice are not monopolies. What separates victory from defeat is whether a system can learn faster than its opponent. And learning often requires listening to voices that feel dangerous, inconvenient, or morally uncomfortable. The Atlantic War was not won the moment the Allies built better weapons. It was won the moment they stopped assuming they already understood the problem. Insight extends far beyond submarines and convoys. Every complex system, military, political, technological, eventually faces the same test. It becomes successful, then confident, then rigid. At that point, it stops listening. Not because it is stupid, but because listening threatens identity. Admitting blind spots feels like weakness. Learning from the enemy feels like contamination. History shows where that path leads. Because German sailors forgot how to fight, but because their system stopped adapting. Doctrine hardened, assumptions fossilized, feedback loops broke, reality kept changing anyway. Allies avoided that fate not perfectly, not permanently, but long enough to win. And they did so by committing what once would have been considered heresy, letting the enemy explain the war back to them. That does not make the U-boat captain a hero. He reflected back truths the Allies needed to hear, and truths Germany could no longer accept. In doing so, he became impossible to categorize. Not innocent, not redeemed, simply useful in the most dangerous way possible. He prefers simpler characters. But the pattern he revealed keeps returning. Every era, conflicts are framed as contests of will and technology. And in every era, they are actually contests of learning. The side that adapts faster wins not because it is morally superior, but because reality enforces consequences without mercy. The Atlantic reminds us that war is not just about defeating enemies. It is about defeating your own assumptions before the enemy does it for you. That is why this story matters. Not because it glorifies intelligence work, but because it exposes the fragile moment where victory is decided quietly, invisibly, long before the shooting stops. The ocean did not turn against the U-boats because the Allies became stronger. It turned because the Allies became less predictable. And with a question no Navy had ever wanted to ask. A question that still makes institutions uncomfortable today. Would you do it? That question was answered. The outcome of the Atlantic War was no longer a matter of chance. And perhaps that is why history tried so hard to forget the man who answered it. Because remembering him means admitting that the most dangerous weapons are not always built. Sometimes they are learned. The silence after the war. After the war, no one asked him to explain himself. In his reasoning, no historian eager to record his perspective, no journalist chasing a headline about the U-boat captain who helped end the Atlantic War. When the paperwork was finished, he became what most wars produce in the end, an anonymous survivor. Silence was intentional. Hated people. They prefer symbols, heroes who fit medals, villains who justify suffering, men who exist in between, who act not out of ideology, but out of judgment, create problems for memory. They blur categories. They force questions that cannot be answered cleanly. The system did what systems often do. It moved on. Kept sailing. The escorts trained new crews. Manuals were rewritten. New officers learned tactics shaped by decisions they would never know the origin of. The war under the Atlantic ended not with a revelation, but with administrative closure. The man who helped turn it faded into civilian life. That disappearance tells us something essential about how wars are remembered. Not everything that changes history is meant to be remembered. The uncomfortable truth is that the Battle of the Atlantic was not won when the Allies finally overwhelmed the U-boats with force. It was won when the Allies stopped believing that force alone could solve the problem. That realization did not come from new technology or intelligence breakthroughs. It came from acknowledging that the enemy was not irrational, not reckless, and not driven purely by fanaticism. Human. Carries consequences far beyond one war. Modern conflicts are increasingly defined by complexity. They involve layered systems, distributed decision-making, and human operators under relentless pressure. In such environments, victory rarely comes from decisive blows. It comes from incremental advantages, small shifts in understanding that compound over time. The Atlantic War offers a case study in how those shifts happen. The Allies did not defeat the U-boats by becoming more aggressive. They defeated them by becoming more disciplined. They learned to resist the urge to react immediately. They learned to delay, to wait, to deny feedback. They learned to control not just the ocean, but the emotional tempo of the fight. It was not a technological leap. And psychology does not belong comfortably in after-action reports. That is why the story remained buried. It required admitting that the enemy contributed indirectly to Allied success. It would have required admitting that learning sometimes requires humility, and humility does not sit well inside narratives of total victory. Instead, the war was framed as a triumph of innovation and production. Those explanations were true enough to satisfy public memory, and incomplete enough to preserve comfort. The boat captain understood this instinctively. He never tried to justify himself publicly. Perhaps he understood that speaking would only invite misunderstanding. Or perhaps he simply recognized that the war was not the right place for explanations, only for consequences. Restraint may be the most revealing detail of all. Stop listening. When leadership confuses certainty with strength, when questioning becomes betrayal. He had lived inside such a system long enough to recognize its end stages. Speaking to the Allies, he did not switch loyalties. He exited a collapsing structure. That distinction matters. Frames defection as moral transformation. In reality, it is often institutional disillusionment. People leave not because they suddenly love the other side, but because the system they serve can no longer absorb reality. The U-boat war illustrates this perfectly. Not defeated because they lost courage. They were defeated because the assumptions that once protected them became liabilities. Their enemy adapted, they did not. Pattern repeats endlessly. That cling to doctrine long after conditions change. In corporations that reward consensus over accuracy. In governments that punish warning signs because they disrupt messaging. The lesson is not that enemies should be trusted. That cannot learn will eventually be outlearned. The Atlantic War ended before Germany's collapse, but its outcome shaped everything that followed. Without secure sea lanes, there is no invasion of Europe. Without logistical dominance, there is no sustained air campaign. Without supply, strategy collapses into wishful thinking. Boats were never just submarines. Strategic lever. That lever failed not because it was weak, but because it was predictable. The Allies did not break it by brute force. How it worked, then changing the rules. Understanding did not come from ideology or moral clarity. It came from a human being who had operated the lever from the inside and was willing to explain when and why it moved. It is a deeply uncomfortable truth. Not only by leaders and battles, but by moments of insight that institutions would rather forget. Moments when learning requires crossing psychological boundaries. Moments when victory depends on listening to voices that do not fit the story. Those moments are rarely celebrated. The Atlantic War teaches us that success often arrives quietly. There is no single moment when the ocean turns. There is no decisive announcement. Instead, losses decline, patterns change, fear migrates, and by the time anyone notices, the outcome is already decided. This is how complex systems fail and how they survive. The side that adapts first rarely announces it. The side that fails rarely realizes it in time. The U-boat captain lived in the space between those outcomes. His defeat, nor the architect of Allied victory. He was something more unsettling, evidence that the war could be understood. Understanding is dangerous. It challenges certainty. It exposes fragility. That's why history often resists it. Only grown. In a world increasingly defined by asymmetric conflict, cyber warfare, information operations, and automated systems, the human layer remains decisive. Machines execute, humans interpret. Fear, fatigue, habit, and assumption still shape outcomes in ways no algorithm fully predicts. The Atlantic War reminds us that the most decisive advantages often emerge not from innovation, but from interpretation. Seeing the battlefield as the enemy sees it. What they do, but why. From recognizing when your own system has stopped learning. That recognition saved the Allies years of bloodshed at sea. It also created a story too complicated to celebrate. But buried stories do not disappear. They resurface when new generations face the same tension between certainty and understanding, when systems once again grow rigid, when listening becomes dangerous, when learning from the outside feels like betrayal. Those moments, history whispers the same warning it always has. Victory does not belong to the side that believes hardest. It learns first. Sometimes, the price of learning is listening to the enemy explain you to yourself. That truth is uncomfortable. Matters. The weight of survival. After the war ended, the ocean remained. Waves still erased tracks within minutes. Sonar pings faded into history. What remained was not the sound of battle, but the silence that followed it. U-boat captain, that silence was heavier than any depth charge. Survival in war is often mistaken for victory, but survival carries its own burden, especially when others did not make it back. The men who went down with their boats, trapped in steel coffins, did not get the chance to reconsider their choices. They did not get to explain themselves. They did not get to live with questions. It separated him from the dead. After the war, no one asked him to speak publicly. No court summoned him. No historian requested his testimony. He was released, processed, forgotten, like millions of others who survived wars that demanded certainty and left behind ambiguity. Survival did not bring relief. He remembered the moment when Allied tactics began to feel different, when escorts behaved strangely, when the ocean no longer reacted the way it used to, when instincts that had kept him alive suddenly failed. He understood what that meant before most commanders did. Someone had been listening. And was not accompanied by triumph, it was accompanied by dread. If the Allies were adapting this quickly, then the war beneath the sea was already over. And if it was over, then every boat still leaving port was being sent into a future that no longer existed. He knew this because he had once been on the other side of that realization, watching Allied convoys continue to follow rules that no longer protected them. The roles were reversed. Stop it. This is the part of war that rarely enters history books. But the moment when someone realizes that knowledge has outrun loyalty, that understanding has made courage irrelevant. That skill is no longer enough to change outcomes. For years, the U-boat campaign had been framed as a test of will, of endurance, of bravery. But beneath all of that was a quieter truth. It was a contest of anticipation. The side that learned faster would survive longer. The Allies began anticipating German reactions before they happened. The contest ended even if the fighting continued. Survival, after such a realization, is not heroic. It is isolating. He returned to his former comrades and warned them. He could not undo what he had already said. He could not reconcile the knowledge that his insight shared in a guarded room far from the ocean had rippled outward into death for men who never knew his name. He likes to assign clean roles. Traitor, patriot. Survivors rarely fit. Germany. He was not honored by the Allies. He occupied a space too narrow for ceremony and too wide for judgment. He had crossed an invisible line, not between nations, but between participation and observation. The line changes how war feels forever. Those who remain inside a war see it as movement missions, orders, risks, victories. Those who step outside it, even briefly, see it as pattern, as structure, as inevitability unfolding in slow motion. The U-boat captain had seen the pattern form. Be unseen. That's why some survivors struggle long after the fighting ends, not because they fear what happened, but because they understand what will happen. They have watched systems reach tipping points. They have felt certainty evaporate. They have learned how quickly skill becomes irrelevant once conditions change. Survival, in those cases, becomes a kind of exile. The world moves on, the war ends, new conflicts emerge, but the survivor remains anchored to a moment when the outcome was already decided, even though the violence continued. It's a difficult place to live. Speak rarely, why some refuse to explain themselves, why silence becomes preferable to narrative. Narratives simplify. Betrayal not of ideology, but of reality. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end when the last U-boat was sunk. It ended when one side stopped being surprised. Everything after that was momentum. The captain lived long enough to understand that difference, and that history would not tell the story that way. Speak of innovation, of production, of courage. It would not speak of the quiet moment when fear changed hands.